You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 122. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Welcome to today's podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm so excited to have you join me here today. Thank you for tuning in. Today's episode is about the highly relatable topic of how to get things done when you don't have that sense of urgency. It's a highly relatable topic, and I'm going to dive right in just a minute. Before that, I would like to share a personal milestone. You may recall, if you follow the podcast, that I spoke the other week about my kids going back to school, or initially my son going off to daycare. So this is kind of a milestone year for me and for him and for our family, really, because it marks 10 years since I transitioned back to work and started navigating the life of childcare and professional work and balancing the two of those things. And one of the anecdotes that I mentioned in that episode was dropping my son off at daycare for the first time and how difficult that was. So today I took the kids to school. I just dropped them off a few minutes ago. And for the first time, my son said to me, he said, "Mom, can you please leave? You're embarrassing me." Now, it might sound like something that a parent would not want to hear. But when he said that to me, I was delighted. I started chuckling and I walked off the schoolyard all happy because this marked a very big milestone for me. When I initially dropped my son off at daycare and in the years that followed, it was really, really challenging. If you have young kids and you're leaving them at daycare or you're leaving them with a nanny and they're crying, they're holding onto your leg, they don't want you to go, and you have that enormous sense of mom guilt as you're dropping them off, that's where I was 10 years ago. And I remember thinking to myself, there will come a time when he doesn't want me to be here, when he's going to push me away. And I can tell you that in the past 10 years, there have been moments where he's been going to school independently for a while now. It's not like this is a brand new thing. He has friends that he kind of runs off to, and I've celebrated every time that has happened, having started out in that initial stages of it being so challenging. But I think this was the first time where he actually used the words, "Mom, you're embarrassing me." I mean, that was like, wow. Okay, we have definitely reached that next level of maturity, milestone, whatever you want to call it. And in fairness, I was kind of on his case about his phone. I mentioned that as well, that we recently got him a phone. So we're navigating the boundaries around that. So I can understand where he's coming from. But again, this was a real milestone for me. And so I share it with you because for any of you, again, who are out there, whatever stage you're at, dropping your kids off at school, the moments that you anticipate that seem so far away in the moment, they come eventually. And when you've kind of given yourself that almost like a goal to look forward to, I'm not sure that it was a goal necessarily for my son to tell me that I was embarrassing him, but for sure, I wanted that level of independence where he's asserting his ground and carving out, his own life in the ways that an 11-year-old boy does that. I see these as positive signs. So thank you for listening as I shared that story with you. And if you can relate, lovely. I hope if your kids are calling you embarrassing, that you can find some joy and humor in that as well. So with that being said, the reason we're here today isn't to talk about phones and drop-offs and how embarrassing I am. What we're here to talk about today is a very real challenge that a lot of lawyers and other professionals experience when it comes to time management. And I think we can all relate to the idea of being busy. And when you are busy, things run smoothly, right? If you've got a million things on your to-do list, chances are you are knocking them off with precision and efficiency. The challenge is that when things slow down, you may find that you have trouble getting focused. So you might allocate a certain amount of time, whether it's you're allocating it in your calendar, you're sitting down for the day, and you tell yourself, okay, I've got the time that I need to work on a specific task, whether it's writing an argument for court, whether it's drafting a complicated agreement, whether it's having a difficult conversation with somebody and preparing for and executing that. And so you've given yourself the time to do it, but you don't actually follow through on it. And you may notice that this is more prevalent in your practice after a busy stretch at work. So for example, if you've just had a hearing or a trial or a big deal that has closed where you were on and you were working at a pace that was a very fast clip, maybe there was a lot of urgency involved in the work that you were doing. So maybe that is a cycle that you've just come off of. Maybe you've just come back from holiday. It can be really challenging when you take a break from work, especially a longer holiday. If you're gone for, let's say, a week or two or more, when you step back into work mode, it can really be difficult to recreate the momentum that you had before going on holidays. Or it may even just be a break from routine. So I can speak for myself right now as we transition back into the school year. It has been a transition to go from summer mode, which was peculiar. I still worked, but it was an odd schedule. So getting back into my routines now is a little bit different. I have a different portfolio of work that I'm doing. And so last week in particular, I noticed I was struggling with this challenge of things not being necessarily urgent, but me wanting to step back into my usual flow, my usual pace. And so if you are coming back, you've dropped your kids off at school and you're now re-entering your usual routine, your non-summer holiday, whatever that looks like for you, mode routine, you may find that you are also having a challenge when it comes to getting work done where it is not particularly urgent. And this is a topic that comes up often in my coaching practice. It's a challenge that I have experienced as a lawyer. I know when I was working as a lawyer, other lawyers and I would talk about this particular challenge. And so if you can relate, you are absolutely not alone. And what I'm going to offer today are 4 strategies and a couple of caveats that you can use to help create an artificial sense of urgency so that you can avoid getting into situations where you're in that true sense of urgency. So you might ask yourself why this is a problem in the first place, why it is a challenge that you and others experience. And if you take a step back, humans are motivated by what is sometimes referred to as the motivational triad. And the goal for each of us humans is to avoid pain, it's to seek pleasure and conserve energy. And this is a model that was developed by Dr. Douglas Lyle and Dr. Alan Goldhamer. So what you will find then is that without urgency, your instincts may be to not work on the thing that you want to work on, even though it's important. So bringing it back to that model, you might want to avoid pain. You might see the task that you're about to embark on as difficult, complicated, large, whatever the kind of painful component of it might be. And so you want to push that off in the short term, even though you know deep down that you're still going to have to deal with it in the long term, but postponing the pain is better than having to experience it in the moment. You may also be pursuing pleasure. And so if you think about what is truly pleasureful in the moment, it may not be opening up the document and doing the hard work of drafting a really complicated agreement. Instead, what you might find is that you want that shorter term pleasure, whether it's going to lunch with a friend or scrolling even, or knocking quick wins off your to-do list. So even answering those emails, the ones that are in your inbox, it's really satisfying. You get to press send, you have that dopamine hit. So you feel like you're being productive, but you're not actually being productive in the sense that you need to be. You haven't followed through on completing the task or working on the task that you've allocated for that window of time. So you get that quick win, you get that quick fix. So you're getting the short-term pleasure, but again, you're not getting your work done. And then finally, if you look at it from the energy standpoint, you want to conserve energy by doing what is most comfortable. And so that increased comfort or that most comfortable option might be not working on that particular project. It might be inaction. And what you might find is, in addition to the motivational triad, so the basic wiring that we all have, you may also find that you've developed a habit. And that habit might be, number one, that you've just fallen out of practice, especially if you're returning from a vacation where you haven't been in that zone of working where things aren't necessarily urgent. You haven't kind of reestablished your routines. it may also be that you're kind of hooked on that whole cycle of having things be urgent, right? Maybe way back in law school or university or even in high school, you are smart and capable, and you may find that you are able to leave things until the last minute and still get them done really, really well. And so you know that you can leave things to the last minute. And so you've trained yourself to wait for that last minute, because not only can you get by, but that last minute has a way of increasing the intensity of the experience. It increases your focus, increases your creativity. It allows you to put those blinders on. You're effectively distraction proof. You can just get that task done quickly. And so you may find that even unconsciously, you're kind of hooked on the whole adrenaline and the pattern of waiting and then executing and then getting success. And the results are fine, even if the process itself is excruciating. So what you might try to do to cope is maybe you try, again, like I mentioned at the beginning, you might try to avoid this urgency cycle or letting things get to the last minute by giving yourself time to do it. You might schedule the time in your calendar and you promise yourself you'll get it done in the time allotted. But instead of getting your work done, you find yourself staring at the screen, looking up sunny destinations that you can travel to. Maybe you start drifting onto LinkedIn and start looking up your old law school classmates. Maybe you decide to grab a snack. Basically, you do anything except the task that you set out to do. And the reason this doesn't work, this idea of simply allocating time and expecting that you're going to fill it doing the task that you've told yourself you're going to do, is that you can think of time and the time that it takes to do a task as expanding to fit the time you allocate. And so, for example, if you think about gas in a container, the gas is going to expand to fill the container that it is in. And the same is true. If you give yourself 2 weeks to do something that really only requires 2 days, chances are you're going to spread that task over the course of 2 weeks. So that's one of the reasons why simply putting the time on your calendar isn't necessarily going to work out. Maybe there's too much time on your calendar in the way that you haven't been precise enough with your schedule. The other thing is that you may need to build momentum. So if you've trained yourself to use urgency as a cue to get started on your task, then you might need to retrain yourself. And what you want to do is to develop momentum. And it's going to be initially quite difficult. There's a stat out there that says that a rocket uses something like 90% of its fuel to simply get off the Earth. That initial requirement to have liftoff is where the real energy is required. And after that, it's got momentum, it's drifting, maybe it's using, I don't know, gravity or some space thing that I really don't understand. But the idea there is that that starting point is where it's really challenging. And the same is true here. If you find that you're unable to get motivated, you're unable to get started without that sense of urgency, chances are you're not operating at a high level of that sort of basic patterns of task initiation. And so here, what we want to do is to help you learn how to step into that momentum so that it becomes easier. You're not trying to launch every single task that you have. You don't have to require that much energy. You fall into a pattern and a habit and a set of systems where that energy is naturally flowing. So when we rely on urgency as the motivator and we don't really take any proactive steps to approach it differently, what can happen is that things take longer than they need. So again, the time expands, the time to do a task expands to fill the time that you've given it. And what happens is you can sometimes start to ask yourself why you're having such a hard time getting things done on time. And this is not a very productive question. Unfortunately, the questions that you ask yourself where they are in the nature of, why is it taking so long? Why can't you just get started on this task? Those questions tend to yield answers that are not lovely answers, things that you might tell yourself. I hope you're not saying these things, but you might be saying, well, it's because you're lazy. It's because the work isn't interesting. It's because the work is too hard to do. It's because you're not motivated. It's because you lack strategy. I mean, these are all answers to the question, why can't I get started? And so these are not the types of questions that we want to be asking ourselves, nor are they the messages that we want to be sending to ourselves. So that's one of the drawbacks if we don't proactively manage our motivation and our task initiation in the absence of urgency. You may also find that you end up wasting time and then doing things at the last minute once they become urgent. And then once again, you might find yourself beating yourself up because you've now repeated this cycle of pushing things to the last minute, having this sort of sweaty, agitated execution of the task. Then and this is the worst part, in my opinion, is that you can start to undermine your relationship with yourself because you feel like you can't trust yourself to get things done on time. And so unless you have an intervention in the way that you're approaching your time and task initiation, the pattern continues. And what that means is that you can't be productive unless something is urgent. And so what can then also happen is that at an unconscious level, you might find that you create a practice for yourself where you create urgency. You rebuild a practice where everything is made to be urgent or to feel urgent because that's what you need to be motivated. And what you'll find then is that it's probably not a pace that you would consider to be sustainable. So that's kind of painting the picture of the background of the challenge. And if you can relate to any of this, you're absolutely not alone. And what we're going to focus on now is how you can go about learning to create a false sense of urgency so that you can avoid that true sense of urgency. So when you're able to initiate tasks at the outset, and you have more control over that, then that will allow you to avoid the situation where the time has drifted, you haven't done the work that you wanted to do, and then it becomes truly urgent. So I mentioned before, I've got 4 different strategies, and I'm going to dive in right now. Now, the first, going back to the topic of today's episode, which is how to create false urgency in order to avoid true urgency. What I would love to preface with here today is that we are going to learn how to use urgency as a spice, not a staple. So what I mean by that is I would like you to think about urgency as the salt that you sprinkle on the steak. It is not the steak itself. We don't want to build a practice where you are building in so much urgency that it is not sustainable and you burn out. That's not the goal of today's episode. What we are focused on today is how to work with your natural motivation. We know that urgency is something that will motivate you. How can we create that in a way that is not truly risky, right? I mean, you might find if you've got a true deadline and you've got to file the materials by 4:00 and there's a real actual deadline, that creates probably a greater sense of urgency than what we're doing here today, which is learning how to create more strategic senses of urgency, if you see what I mean there. So the idea here is to learn how to effectively manipulate urgency and your experience of it so that it's motivating. What we're trying to do here is create habits. So if you think about that rocket analogy, right now, it's almost like we're using urgency to initiate those habits. And once those habits are in place, they become the default. I'll use the example, it's a personal one, of running in the morning. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit in a minute because it's relevant to one of the strategies. But the idea here is that I exercise first thing in the morning. It's a strategy that I adopted. I've had that strategy for years, but around January 2020, I dialed it in at a very conscious level and I've stuck to it ever since. And one of the reasons is because it is now a default for me to get up and exercise first thing in the morning, whether it's 5 a.m. on a weekday or maybe a bit later on a weekend. It's natural. It now feels more awkward for me not to exercise than it does to exercise. But at the beginning, it was the other way around. So what we're trying to do here is use urgency as a catalyst to get you started on a routine that works for you. And again, as I mentioned before, the goal here is to leverage urgency as a way to motivate you to accomplish certain tasks. Again, it's not to create a chronic state of panic. So that's step 1, is to use urgency as a spice, not a staple. Now, before we move on, I wanted to highlight, and this will become more relevant again as we step into step number 2, which is to schedule strategically. But going back to that staple concept, I have got a number of podcast episodes that relate to time management. You can look up time management. You can look up procrastination. You will see that there are tons of podcast episodes on this very topic. And I would recommend, if you haven't already, to go back to episode number 2. I set out there some of the very basics about time management. And I'd invite you to look at that because that's going to offer you some tools and suggestions for simple strategies. There's also a fairly early episode about time-saving systems. And so you might like that one as well. And then finally, as another recommendation, particularly for this topic of urgency, is a podcast episode about task initiation. It's in the executive function and time management series that I did. There are 4 episodes. The first of those is task initiation. So go to those episodes and develop a robust understanding of time management so that you've got some of the framework in place. Again, we don't want urgency to be the substance, the framework, the basic sort of foundation of your time management. This is a spice. It's an additional tool that you can use once you've already got some systems in place. So again, go back to some of those earlier episodes and think about how you can structure your time. And if you've already got a system in place, great. This will help you tweak some of those systems. So again, that first one, use urgency as a spice, not a staple. Second step is to schedule strategically. Now, I'm going to offer you a few ideas when it comes to scheduling. These are ideas, for the most part, that I've talked about in previous episodes, so it might be review, in which case that's great. This will only serve to help you refine the way that you schedule your time. So the first suggestion is to break your days up using anchors. Now, anchors are a concept I learned from my dear friend Mylène Morancy, who is a professional organizer. We had a podcast episode together a while back, and I would love to bring her back on. Anchors are basically events that will happen in the day, regardless. And so there are natural breaks and blocks through every day, and then there are scheduled activities that will occur during a day. Now, I want you to go back to that example. Let's say you have a brief to write and you've given yourself the day to do it. You sit down, it's 8 or 9 in the morning. You know you're going to leave the office at 5 or 6, and you say to yourself, okay, I've got a full day ahead of me and I'm going to work on my brief. It feels very vague. There's this vague allocation of time and there's a vague project that you're working on. So when you start introducing anchors, what you're going to do is you're going to start looking for the breaks and the events in your day that you can start planning around. So for example, every time you start a work day, there's the starting point and there's an end point. Those are 2 anchors. If you have lunch, there's a lunch break in the middle. If you decide to go for a walk in the afternoon, there's another break. Maybe you have lunch at noon, you have a walk at 3, and maybe if you start early in the morning, you might feel like 10 o'clock is a great time to go grab a cup of tea. So instead of having an 8-hour or 9-hour or however many hour window of unstructured time ahead of you, you now have little chunks of time. Maybe they're 2-hour blocks, maybe they're 1-hour blocks, but you've got little chunks, you've got pockets. And so you can use those to structure your time around. So what are some natural breaks and blocks you might have in your day? Well, you might have, like I said, the time you arrive at work, leave work, lunch, walks, breaks. Work events also can constitute anchors. If you're looking at your day in the morning and you see, okay, I've got a meeting at 10, I've got a phone call at 3, maybe you're preparing for a hearing that's the next day, maybe it's the day of, maybe you've got a deadline for submissions, maybe you've got discoveries. So these are the things that are happening in your calendar. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that I started an exercise routine. And when I did that back in early 2020, I looked at the calendar for the whole family. I was not able to, I like running, but it requires that I leave the house. I've got kids at home, can't really leave when they are asleep. And if my husband is traveling, which he does travel for work. And I also found that if I was trying to schedule exercise during the workday, which I could do because I was working remotely, I found it was too disruptive to do it in the middle of the day. And I didn't like the flexibility of it because then I was always trying to figure out when am I going to fit the exercise in. So what I decided was that I would put my exercise window first thing in the morning, which meant that on some days it had to be 5 o'clock so that I could be home by 6, which is when my husband typically needs to leave for work in the morning. So what I did was I simply designated that space, that morning space for exercise. And what that did is it created a pocket that I could now step into. So now that has become one of my anchors. It has now become a routine. Now, one of the nice things about anchors is that it creates a bit of an urgency. So for me, knowing that I had to be home by 6 o'clock meant that when the alarm went off at 5, I either went for a run and I was home at 6, which is about how long it takes me to wake up, run, and be home, or I'd have to forego my exercise. And it was more important for me to get the exercise than not. And so that was a motivating factor for me. Now, if you take it in the office context, let's say you have a brief to write and you have that full day. Okay, now you've got little chunks. So what you can do is you can take your brief and you can divide the brief writing process into chunks. Maybe there's draft an outline. Maybe there's complete the research. Maybe there's set out the headings. Maybe there's proofread, whatever the steps are for your brief writing exercise. If you're drafting a contract, you'll have steps for that. If you have a difficult conversation you're having, you might have steps for how you're going to approach that. So the idea here is you want to break up your day into chunks, and you want to break up your projects, especially the big ones, into chunks. If they're smaller chunks like drafting emails or things that are already broken down into fairly discrete tasks, you don't need to really break them up any further. But for larger tasks, it helps to break them down, because then you can start slotting in the activities to where they fit best. And I'll give you some more strategies of how to do that most effectively. The first being to assign value to your blocks. So you've got these blocks of time, you've got your work that you need to do. I like to think of the blocks as blocks where there are high productivity periods and low productivity periods. So you will have a different sense of productivity based on how you're wired. If you're a morning person, then your morning block of activity is going to be more powerful than your afternoon block. So you might want to match the difficult, more challenging tasks to your morning block instead of your afternoon block, and vice versa. So if you're like me, you'll want to schedule meetings in the afternoon. You'll want to schedule emails in the afternoon, things that either you get stimulated. If I have a meeting with somebody, I'm automatically stimulated. I wake up. If I am feeling a little bit lower energy, which sometimes happens to me mid-afternoon, that energy picks up because now I'm engaging with another person. Or if I don't really need 100% of my focus, I can probably do some routine emails. So that's how I like to strategize. Now, that in itself creates some urgency if you're using your blocks, because now you need to fill your blocks. If you've got, if you know you've got a 2-hour window, you can break that task. You can be more effective within that time frame. Where you can also create urgency is by using those value blocks. So if you know that your best block for writing is from 9 to 10 in the morning, then you're going to want to use that time, because once that time is up, you can no longer use that high energy time, if that makes sense. Now, what you can also do is, let's say there's a low value task that you've been procrastinating on to the point that it has reached a level of urgency. What I like to recommend and what I like to do myself is to take that low level task and then put it into that high value time slot. So I think of it like real estate almost. It's like there's a high value real estate and then there's a low value real estate. And sometimes I'll take a low value task and I'll put it in that high value area, because then I know I'm going to get it done because there's a higher cost to me. So that's number 2, is to assign value to those blocks. And sorry, there are 4 suggestions within suggestion number 2. So these are all scheduling suggestions. So I hope this is not too confusing. I will review them at the end. So number 1 was to break up your day using anchors. Number 2 was to assign value to the blocks of time that will result from placing your anchors. Number 3 is to use the Pomodoro method. This is very simple. This is setting a timer. Pomodoro comes from the Italian word for tomato, which I gather they have tomato timers in Italy. They're typically 25 minutes long. You can set a timer for however long you need. 5 minutes is plenty if that's what you need to just get that initial momentum running. So set a timer, and just having a timer running will give you that sense of urgency that you may require to initiate a task. And then you want to also think about doing sprints of activity. So that might help you just to get those sprints in. And then tip 4, when it comes to scheduling strategically, is to make sure that you create leisure time and stick to it. And this has 2 benefits. Number 1 is it creates another anchor, right? And so these anchors are really important. When you think about working on a project, for example, let's say it's 11:30 and you're feeling a bit tired and you have lunch plans at noon with one of your colleagues. You can probably look at your clock and say, you know what, I can keep myself on task for another 30 minutes because I know at noon I'm going to step up, I'm going to go outside, I'm going to have lunch with a friend, then I'm going to resume my work after that. That pocket of time can then be used really efficiently, versus if you had no lunch plans at all and you thought, okay, well, I'm feeling kind of tired, but I'm just going to do it anyways. And so you kind of drift a little bit and maybe you don't end up getting very much done. And then eventually you decide, okay, fine, I guess it's time to go have lunch. And so 12:30 you go have lunch, but you've spent an hour drifting. So you can see how having that leisure time scheduled into your calendar creates urgency, because you can then use that time pressure to get things done ahead of your leisure or your lunch or whatever it happens to be. It also gives you downtime. So one of the challenges that we can often face, especially when we're stacking up our days with productive work focus, is that we need a bit of time to recharge. So if you're giving yourself little pockets here and there overall, it will enhance your efficiency. For some people, it means going to the gym in the afternoon. It's never worked for me, but it might work for you. It might be scheduling a walk in the afternoon. That does work for me. I love that. Just even if it's a walk around the block, just time to get some air, get out of your kind of immediate space. It opens up creativity. It helps you feel better. It's energizing. So you want to block those things in. So if we step back, I'm just going to let you know where we are because you may feel a little bit disoriented. We talked about 4 global strategies for creating or learning how to use false urgency to avoid true urgency. Number 1, use urgency as a spice, not a staple. Number 2, we're going to schedule strategically. And I offered 4 suggestions for how you can schedule strategically. Number 1 is to break your days up using anchors. Number 2, assign value to those time blocks and use them strategically. Number 3, use the Pomodoro method. So set a timer and do a sprint for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 25 minutes, whatever time frame works most for you, given the task that you have on hand. And then number 4 was to create leisure time and stick to it. Again, that's going to give you some additional anchors as well as some downtime so that you can re-energize. Now, the third strategy that we're going to cover when it comes to creating urgency or a false sense of urgency is to use other people to create accountability. Now, this is not a new strategy. It is effective if what you find is that you're better at making promises to other people than you are to yourself. So let somebody else know, right? Maybe there's a colleague that you're working on a file with. Let them know I'm going to have that brief ready by Thursday. And I'd like to circle back with you when it's done, or I'm going to send you a draft. Maybe it's a client that you're making that promise to. Client, we've got the contract that I'm drafting. I'm going to send you the contract for your review on Tuesday afternoon, whatever it happens to be. But give somebody else a promise that you intend to deliver, and that will create a little deadline for you, a little milestone, a sense of urgency that you have created to get that job done. And it might be that you need to break it up, right? Again, if the task is enormous and there's multiple steps, maybe it's making a commitment for that first step. Another way to do this is to simply have somebody that you check in with. So if you have an assistant that you have a decent relationship with, you might say to your assistant, listen, I'm just going to do this thing where I'm going to check in with you to let you know what I'm working on. You don't have to do anything. I just want to have that follow up with you. And that's probably a pretty good practice. If I think about the way that I like to work and the way that I recommend lawyers work with their assistants is if it makes sense in your relationship to have a weekly check-in where you simply check in with your assistant, let them know what you're working on, figure out what's on their plate. It creates accountability. It creates momentum because every week, if you know that you have that meeting, that's an opportunity to discuss things that might be happening that you would like to check in on. As they happen during the week, you might be keeping a list, a little checklist, a scrap paper, a note on your phone of the things that you want to talk about. So it's great for that. And it can also be great for keeping that momentum up. If you find that you're at week 3 where you keep telling your assistant, oh yeah, I mean to send that email out to schedule the meeting with the client, and 3 weeks have gone by, you'll start to notice, and your assistant might be able to help you to actually make that happen. Of course, working with a coach is also an option. Work with somebody who can help you develop a sense of accountability with them and also with yourself and with others who are in your professional and personal life. So that was step number 3, was to create accountability. Number 4 is to curate your inner dialogue. So you want to notice what it is that you're telling yourself in the moments that you are procrastinating, in the moments where you've set aside the time to do something and you're not doing it. Now, chances are some of what you might be telling yourself sounds something like this. This can wait. It's too late to start today. So you might find that your day gets ahead of you and you sat down with the best of intentions to do the project, the brief, the contract, whatever. The emails were flowing in, something urgent came up at work, a friend stopped by and you were talking and you lost an hour there. I mean, there could be all sorts, I shouldn't say lost, but you know what I mean? You know, the day got ahead of you or away from you. And so it's now 3:00. You look at the clock and you think, well, this is going to take me at least 5 hours to get this brief done. I only have 2 hours. It's not worth starting today. I'll just do it tomorrow. So that might be a message that you're telling yourself. It's too late to start today. Maybe the thought going through your mind is, I'm never going to finish, so why bother starting? Or maybe because the true deadline is 2 weeks away, you might be telling yourself, I have lots of time. I can start this tomorrow. So I just want you to pay attention and notice what you're telling yourself that is leading to the result that you don't particularly like, which is that you're not getting work done unless it's urgent. Now, the next step, of course, is to ask yourself what other messages you could give yourself that would generate energy. So going back to the motivational triad where we're talking about pursuing pleasure, avoiding pain, and conserving energy, you might use that framework to think about ways or questions or statements you can make to yourself. So for example, you might think of the pleasure component of getting your work done on time or early. So you might focus on the relief that you're going to feel and other benefits of getting started. You might tell yourself it will feel so good when this is finished, or this is the perfect task to knock off my list. You might tell yourself once I file the brief, I can stop thinking about it, or it will be so much easier after I write the first paragraph. So these are some ideas. You, of course, will be motivated by the messaging that you will come up with for yourself. So I'd encourage you to think about that. What messages focus on the pleasure, the benefit of starting your work now versus pushing it off into the future? Now, another component of the motivational triad, of course, is conserving energy. So what are some of the messages you could give yourself that focus on conserving energy? Here are some ideas. One might be, I have 10 minutes. What's one thing I can do before I leave for the day? So it's not a huge investment of energy. You're just looking at 10 minutes. You can also ask yourself, what step will create the greatest impact in the shortest period of time? Again, you're focused on not necessarily getting everything done, but what's one thing? What's the greatest impact step you can take in the shortest period of time? Another question you might ask yourself is, what is the easiest win? So again, you're focused on questions that make the task seem less overwhelming, less daunting, less big. And then third, you might use pain as motivation. So what is something painful that will happen if you don't start your task? And so the messaging might be, if I don't start now, I won't have time for my daughter's rehearsal tomorrow. If I don't start now, I might not have time to work on that new file that's coming in tomorrow. So you're thinking about the consequences that will follow from not executing on your task in the moment. Now, I mentioned before that sometimes we ask ourselves questions that are not very productive. Questions like, why is this taking me so long? Why can't I just get my work done? Why do I always do this to myself, etc.? Those are not great questions because we don't really love the answers. We're not going to come up with answers that are very helpful. So what are some questions that are helpful? Questions that are helpful. What's the next step? What's one thing I can do? What's the easiest first step? What is the greatest impact first step? So it's again, thinking about what are questions that are helpful. What would be great about getting this project done early? That's a great question. So again, we're wanting to be intentional about the messaging, the questions, the conversation, that internal narrative. We're wanting to curate it so that it's leading to better outcomes, so that it's motivating you to get your work done instead of kind of keeping you in that holding pattern. And again, I mean, if these are topics, if you're resonating with what I'm sharing here, I invite you to go back to other podcast episodes. I talk a lot about procrastination. And so you can go back to previous episodes where I talk about procrastination, that task initiation. All those topics are ones that can help you build a skill set that will better equip you to deal with the problem that, you know, you've got stuff to do, but it's not urgent. And so it's really hard to get started on it. Now, I wanted to offer a couple of caveats. Now, just to recap, I offered 4 main strategies. Those strategies, of course, use urgency as a spice, not a staple. Schedule strategically. So you're wanting to break up your days using anchors. You're wanting to assign value to your time blocks and then use the time blocks strategically. You want to use the Pomodoro method, so setting a timer to create a sense of urgency. You want to create leisure time and stick to it. That gives you both anchors as well as rest. Number 3 is to create accountability. So you want to create accountability with other people, whether they're people that you're working with on a particular file, clients, other lawyers, or if it's a friend or an assistant or a coach, somebody who you can use more as an accountability partner. And then finally, number 4, you want to curate your inner dialogue. So that's paying attention to what you're currently telling yourself and then thinking about what you could tell yourself that would be more motivating, bearing in mind the motivational triad of pursuing pleasure, avoiding discomfort, and conserving energy. So the caveats is, number 1 is sometimes we do leave things to the last minute. Now, I will make a confession, which I've probably made before, is that I typically record my podcast episodes like this podcast episode on Wednesdays. Wednesdays are the day that I must submit my podcast episode to the producer of the podcast, or I think I need to pay an additional fee or something. I think that's the consequence that follows. And I stay motivated. I know that Wednesdays are the day that I'm going to submit. I don't think I've ever submitted one late yet. And, I have a process now. I start thinking about my podcast on Fridays usually. I try to have an outline ready by Monday. I try to refine the outline or think about it further on Tuesday. And then Wednesday, I'll carve out a time in my day to do it. So that has become a practice for me where I know that I'm going to leave it to the last minute. This is the day of, but I also have a process that allows me to do it at the last minute, taking the benefit of the urgency. I know that I don't have more time to do it, but I've also structured it in a way that it doesn't feel uncomfortable to me. It now feels quite natural. Now, if there are things that come up, like I'm going to be traveling or I'm going to be busy on a Wednesday, then I'll do it differently. I'll schedule time to do it in advance, but that's how I have chosen to do it. And you might find the same thing. If you've got a particular type of court application that is one that you do frequently, you have a fairly clear idea of how long it's going to take you, you feel confident that you can do it. If you leave it to last minute, you may find that there is a benefit to not spending tons and tons of time on something and to leaving it to the last minute. I use air quotes there because it's efficient, because you're going to get it done and you actually don't need to spend more time on it. So that's one caveat, is that sometimes leaving things to the last minute is fine. It's part of your practice. If it makes sense and it works for you, you probably don't need to change it. Now, the other caveat that I wanted to offer is that, again, going back to this idea of we want urgency to be something that you're in control of. You want to have that foundational time management practice that you're building on so that it's not like you're using urgency as the primary tool. It's an adjunct. It's a part of a more complete toolkit. And so you want to notice if you're feeling particularly anxious. Now, this can happen in a discrete way. It might be there's a particular day when you're feeling anxious. Maybe there's a few hours in the day where you feel overwhelmed. What I would invite you to do there is to pause, first of all, write a list of all the things that you need to do. Look at that list and give your list a priority. I do this often where I'll feel like, wow, okay, all of a sudden there's a lot happening. I'll write on a piece of paper a list of what's happening. And then next step, put numbers next to the items on your list. Think about which ones need to go first based on urgency or staleness or desire sometimes. Give it a list, give it a hierarchy, and then your task is going to be to simply execute on your list. And what you want to do potentially is to recalibrate your sense of urgency. If you find that you've gotten yourself into a panic, then you're going to want to calm yourself down. So you might be telling yourself something like, this can wait, right? Now you're almost doing the opposite. You're dialing back the urgency. This can wait. I have all the time that I need. I'm exactly at the right place that I need to be right now. And I did a whole episode about time scarcity. You might want to listen to that one too. It's really talking about the idea of how we can relate to time in a different way so that we don't feel like time is scarce, that we're running out of time, we don't have enough time, etc. So here, what you're wanting to do is just make sure that if you're experiencing urgency at a level that is creating discomfort, you want to take a step back from that and kind of revisit your approach and your relationship with urgency and time. Now, if you find that it's chronic, like you really can't do anything unless it's truly urgent, then you might want to revisit whether there's a bigger question at play. Now, this might be health related. It might be that you're really tired, you're not really able to take care of yourself, that it's hard for you to get anything done because you're not rested, whatever that might look like. It may also be that you're simply disengaged with the work that you're doing. You no longer have an interest in it. You don't want to do it. Your body is telling you this is not right. So there are a number of reasons why you might experience that approach where you just simply don't want to do your work. That is probably the topic of another podcast. I've done podcast episodes about finding your values. I've done podcast episodes about maintaining balance. And so I would invite you to think about, is there something else going on here that you would like to dig into? So again, those caveats is number one, sometimes it's fine to leave things to the last minute. And number two, we want to avoid panic. We want to avoid urgency as being the primary currency of your time management practices. We want to make sure it's sort of the spice, not the substance. So why this is going to work? Well, if you do not have to wait for actual urgency in order to get motivated and you can manufacture it, then you can do your work ahead of time. Instead of working against yourself, you can work with a natural motivator to get your work done ahead of time even, and to feel the peace and calm that comes along with that. What can happen then is after you get into that practice, once you've initiated momentum, you may find that you're then biased toward movement. You may have heard Newton's law of motion: an object in motion stays in motion. So if you can bring yourself to that point where you are routinely initiating tasks without that urgency requirement, that then becomes your new normal. So over time, you don't need the urgency to motivate you into action. You simply take the action, and that becomes your habit. So again, that's me, 5 o'clock. Alarm goes off, and it's easy because that's just the habit. I don't think about it. I just do it. Same for you. Necessary skills. To do this work, number one, you'll need a willingness to step back and structure your time. Again, I think really looking at how you're managing your time at a broader level. So are you doing a weekly schedule for yourself? Are you looking at what's on your plate? Are you looking at your file list and what deliverables you have on the horizon? You want to have a fairly good handle on your workload, and that be the substance. And again, I highly recommend episode number 2 if you're looking for some ideas on how to manage your practice, just even getting that base level structure in place. You will also need the discipline of using your calendar to motivate you. So that means you're going to need to develop the skill of looking at your day and using anchors and using time blocks. It's not as complicated as it sounds. Once you get into it, it will flow quite naturally. It also means scheduling, every morning you're going to want to check in with your schedule, check in with your to-do list, and do that planning. So it means having a fairly consistent relationship with your calendar and your day and thinking about what you're doing with the moments of your day. It requires self-compassion. So we want you to be running your practice. We want this to be proactive versus reactive. And so here, the messaging for you and the messaging you can tell yourself is that you're using urgency as a motivator. You are running the show here as opposed to letting urgency run the show for you. So you're flipping the power dynamic and you are now the one who's in control. It requires self-awareness. So we're going to need for you to develop that skill of noticing what's going on for you and leveraging your natural motivators. You might also start to notice, going back to that point that I addressed earlier in relation to panic, if the urgency is absolutely required to get you motivated, is there something else going on here? And if you gain that self-awareness, if you start noticing what you're doing moment to moment, you'll then potentially tap into something else that's going on that you can then focus on and turn your attention to. And what this will create overall, when you learn to adopt, again, sort of those basic time management practices, and then you bring in urgency as a tool that you can use to initiate those tasks, even when they aren't urgent, what you'll find is you now have greater control over the gas pedal. You get to control the pace a lot more. You might find that there are fewer situations that are truly urgent. When you're getting your work done in advance, you're no longer leaving things to the last minute as a matter of course. And so the number of urgent matters goes away. And well, I shouldn't say it goes away entirely. There will be those urgent matters that do come up, but the ones that you have control over, they will start to reduce in number. And what you'll also find is that you develop that confidence with yourself that you can trust yourself to get things done even when they're not urgent. And that relationship that you have with you, that you will follow through on what you say you're going to do, is one of the most important relationships that you are going to develop over your lifetime and in your practice. So, my dear friend, thank you for joining me for today's episode. It has been such a pleasure to speak with you about this topic. I hope you've found some nuggets in here that you can go out and apply in your practice. If you want further assistance, if you'd like to go deeper on this work, by all means, please do reach out to me. I would be more than happy to work with you to help you set up time management systems, to help figure out where your challenges are, where your opportunities are. It's work that I absolutely love doing. And so do feel free to reach out to me. You can do that on LinkedIn, by email, wherever you find me online. I would also love for you to share, if you like this podcast, to share a review and a rating on whatever platform you're using to listen to your podcast. And I would also love it if you would share this podcast with a friend. It always is such a delight to me when I speak with lawyers who were referred to this podcast by somebody that they know. It is such a pleasure. And I just love that we're able to bring more people into the fold, that we're able to share these tools with more lawyers. And I love the community that we are creating through this work. So my dear, dear friend, thank you again for joining me. It's been such a delight. I am going to sign off now and very much look forward to reconnecting with you again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.